back, Team Awesome. All right, guys, today we're going to talk a little bit about 10 key questions that forensic anthropologists have to answer. This is something that comes up all the time when bones are dropped off at our desk, or even if we're out in the field and being asked to look for said bones. There are always these key questions that are running through our head. This is kind of all the time. Every time we're dealing with decedent bones, we have to run through these questions in any scenario. Number one, is it bone? Believe it or not, quite often, even if you're a well-trained forensic anthropologist, we get fooled, especially when you're walking down, the trail or you're searching for something. Things can mimic bone quite a bit. I've run into down power lines that had been burned in a forest fire that looked exactly like a broken end of a femur. I've seen bits and pieces of plastic and pieces of wood, all sorts of stuff that look like bone. Luckily, as soon as we get close or we touch it, we pick it up, we can pretty much instantly know whether it's bone. And I'll teach you what to look for later on. This is just a quick primer, really. Things can look like bone, but are not. The thing over here, let me see if I can figure out how to, there we go. The thing over here, this little piece, this is found in the dirt. You can see this is outside somewhere. And it looks like a piece of bone. In fact, I can even break down to which bone it looks like. It looks a lot like a piece of a fibula, which is in the lower leg. But in fact, these fragments are not bone at all. This upper one is actually a piece of a shell, and this lower one is a rock. And they together both look a lot like pieces of that bone. This part here looks exactly like bone. In fact, it's colored like bone. It is textured like bone on the outside. The key here is right along the edges and the back side of this are dead smooth. In any broken bone, especially a piece of cranium like this is trying to mimic, this would be, in fact, have little holes in it. It's called cancellous bone or spongy bone or trabecular bone. That has little holes in it. It looks almost like a sponge, thus the name spongy bone. The outside of this looks exactly like bone because it is a cast made from an actual bone, a mold of a bone. It's supposed to mimic bone, but in fact it's made out of resin. It's made out of a plastic. So it is in fact not bone. But boy, a lot of people can be fooled by it. These things can actually be brought into our desks sometimes and plopped on our desk, brought in by either police officers or medical examiners or detectives who are like, we found these things in this guy's apartment. And be like, no, it's no big deal. It's a piece of plastic. The next key question is it human? Now, this is one of those slides. I wish we were face to face. I love this slide in a face to face. First of all, the looks of people's faces when they see this for the first time. This thing became famous as the Atacama, because it's from the Atacama Desert, alien, which is in South America. This is not an alien. This entire skeleton is about maybe 6 inches long. So you tell me, what do you think? Is it an alien? It looks humanoid. It's got 2 arms, 2 legs. It's got all the bones we would expect to see. The ribs are there, the arms, even the little hands. And you can especially see on the distal hand, the hand on the other side of his body, which you can see from the side there, looks very hand-like. This is either an incredible model, an alien, which is what a lot of people on TV would have you think, or something else. Any idea what this might be? First of all, you guys, this is human. This is a stillborn infant. It's a fetus. What we're looking at here is what tends to happen to the skull of a naturally born child. The skull becomes sort of elongated. It squeezes through the birth canal. This child was dead upon birth, and it was preserved. In other words, it was kept safe, probably put into a box or a coffin or something like that, which protected it from scavengers and insects. We'll talk a lot about that later on. This is in fact an infant mummy. We find these a lot, and they have that elongated head like that, which makes people who don't know about natural childbirth and don't really understand what it does to the infant's head when they come through the birth canal, this is typical of what a stillborn child mummy looks like. I've got all kinds of stories about finding these things in, not me personally, but forensic anthropologists finding these things and detectives and stuff like that. Up in attics, in cities where you wouldn't expect to find these things. Car trunks, all sorts of things. Now, this is not child abuse. It is somebody who didn't have a place to bury their child and they had a stillborn baby. What are you going to do? You're not going to flush it down the toilet or throw in the garbage cans, which you usually do. Put it in a trunk and put it in the attic if you don't have a place to bury it, or put it in the basement, or put it in the trunk of your car, or something along those lines to try to preserve the baby as best you can. It's basically a burial. Further question, is it human? Here we have a human hand, which is pretty obviously an x-ray in life. You can actually see the soft tissue on it. We've got a human hand on the right. On the left is something that we may find in the field. Is it human? Is that a human hand? The truth is, no, it is not. This is a bear paw. Now, normally, especially black bear, they tend to be smaller. Their paw bones look very human-like, and they're about the right size. The difference is they're not quite the right shape, and of course, if the claws are still there, you can clearly see, okay, this is a bear paw. It's got claws on the end instead of the fingertips, which the human has. However, a lot of hunters, especially sport hunters, cut off the tips of the fingers of the bear to keep the bear claw as a hunting trophy. So when we find these, it can look like, oh my God, I've got a human hand here, which also doesn't necessarily mean a forensics case. Human hands get amputated a lot. But in this case, it is just a bear paw, not a human hand, therefore not a forensics case. The next question, now this is fascinating. Is it modern? We don't see this so often here in the United States, although we sometimes do. This is actually Ötzi, which is known as the Iceman. He was found in the Tyrolean Alps. And the big question was, when hikers came across this, they see clearly a body. I don't know if you guys can make out, but we've got a head, a spine, his arm here, and his other arm across his face here. Everybody freaked out and we're like, oh my God, this is like some dead hiker that fell off the path and froze to death or something. So they called in the authorities. The authorities came and started chiseling it out with pickaxes, and they're actually using a hiker's pole, kind of like a ski pole. And then midway through the police investigation, a detective looked over and saw there was a stone knife, like a knife made out of flint, by him. Then they found a couple of other things that were like, this is a little older than what we thought. It turns out this body, flesh on, still intact. It's a mummy. You can see how it's desiccated, but it's been frozen in that ice for longer than the pyramids are old. Ötzi is 4,500 years old. Actually, that was what they had initially thought he was. Eventually, through more study, they realized he's actually older than that. He's 5,300 years old. Some push it all the way back to 5,400. Bottom line is, he's about 1,000 years older than the pyramids. And he's still intact. The human body is amazing. Ice is an incredible preserver. We all know that because we put things in the freezer to preserve it. Well, Ötzi is still on display. He's, of course, in a refrigerated place, and he's only studied every once in a while. Interesting story, though. If this was 4,000 or 5,300 years ago, this would have been a forensics case because Ötzi was, in fact, murdered. They eventually, although it took them a little while, found that he had an arrowhead in his back, right beside his scapula, which is right here. They found an arrowhead that had punctured his lung and probably his subclavian artery, meaning he died fairly quickly and then was somehow iced over. It's a very interesting story. We, of course, don't know his whole story. We never will, probably, but it's really fascinating. However, remember the first episode of our show, we said if it's more than 100, in fact, if it's more than 50 years old, it is not forensics. It is paleopathology. It is an ancient case, but nobody's going to go to jail. Whoever killed Ötzi is not going to go to jail because they're dead. They've been dead for a very long time. This next one is a really interesting case, too. I'll let you look at that for a minute. You guys see what we're seeing here? We've got a man's body face down in rubble. His back is exposed. You can see the flesh. It looks pretty well preserved, doesn't it? First of all, let me tell you where this is. This is on Mount Everest. You may start to look at some of the accoutrement on this guy. He's got layers of clothing, which look decidedly tan and brown in color. You can also see a rope. It's a hemp rope tied around his waist and up over his shoulder. Do you see all that? When they looked at the collar of this guy, they were actually looking for him and his climbing companion. It was a National Geographic study funded. They went up looking for this guy and his teammate's body. This was the first person in modern history, anyway, that we know of, well, certainly first European, to attempt to climb and summit Mount Everest. This is Mallory's body. Mallory and Irvin went up Mount Everest in 1922. They didn't make it back down. It was not until 1953 that Edmund Hillary went up and came back down, with Tenzing Norgay, of course, and Tenzing is probably the reason he made it. But Edmund Hillary was South African, I believe. Either that or he might be New Zealander, I forgot. So he went up and summited. Very interesting. And Hillary said, you know, it really only matters if you come back down, which, whatever. But this was Mallory's body. They never did find Irvin, and they were looking for a camera to try to see if they actually had summited way back in 1922. We don't know still. They didn't find the camera. They did figure out what killed him, though. And then they buried him in place. But it's a very interesting story. But again, it shows you the preservation. If it's a dry, cold climate, that's how well a mummy can be preserved. This mummy was discovered nearly 100 years after he had died. Isn't that amazing? Okay, question number 4. What bones are present? In this case, again, we have a child. These are infant bones, which are often confused for other animals and other people by untrained eye, but we have 2 femora. These are the upper 2 bones are the femurs of a child, right? So we've got a left and right. And then this one is a tibia, and this one is the fibula of a child. So these are the leg bones of a kid. But the big question about which bones are present lead us to the next important question. The question is there more than one person present in this grave? In other words, are they representing, the bones that we see, are they representing more than one person? Now, how would you figure that out? Think about it this way. Remember on the last slide, we had 2 femurs. One was a left and one was a right. So could those come from the same person, a left and a right femur? Yes. What if we had 2 left femurs? Then our minimum number of individuals, our MNI, goes up to 2, etc., etc. If I find 2 right arms, I know I've got at least 2 people involved, even if those are the only bones I find. Even if I find 2 kneecaps and they both come from the same leg. And I hear you thinking, well, what if somebody has 2 left legs? Literally never happens. Sometimes people will have supernumerary things, usually from an absorbed twin or something like that, where they have what's called a parasitic twin, where they might have something like that going on. But let me tell you, the rarity there is way too high, and we would already know if we were looking for if Clyde with 3 legs died, we would know we found him immediately. Does that make sense? Okay, so minimum number of individuals, MNI, becomes extremely important. Let me show you how that works. What do we have here? We've got what appears to be a human body laid out. But if you look at it a little closer, you realize something's not right here. Let me point it out. Here's a femur, 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 here's a femur. And then here's an os coxa. Here is what appears to be maybe a tibia. It's hard to tell from here, and the picture kind of breaks up. What we have here is fairly typical in certain places where graveyards where the bones are laid out. This happens to be in Peru, where graves are often looted. These ancient graves, they'll go and they'll dig them up to find stuff that's often packaged in the grave with the individual, and then they'll sell it on the antiquities market. We see this in places that have an ancient history of burial in burial sites that are easy to get to. Like we see it in Egypt, of course. We see it in places like Peru and places like parts of China, parts of Siberia, things like that. We see these piles of bone just laying around these graveyards where people have gone through and looted the graveyards to find stuff and then just sort of throw the bones. And then a prankster will come along and just lay out a human shape or whatever in bones to freak out their friends or do whatever. But then sometimes these things happen and we get called out and we're like, oh, okay. Now, in a graveyard like this, it's not a big deal. You can see there's bone laying everywhere. You can see all these bones. Here's pieces, fragments of crania, the skull. Here's bits and fragments. This is a scapula. Here's a rib. Here's what appears to be, well, that's hard to tell what that is. Little bits of bone. You guys see all this stuff laying everywhere. It's all human bone. But it is not a forensics case because this is a graveyard. And it's a not very well kept graveyard, so there's stuff laying everywhere. Let me tell you, I used to teach in Louisiana, in New Orleans. And in New Orleans, as many of you probably know, and some of you may not know, the Christian burials anyway, Jewish burials are still underground in high ground areas, but the Christian burials, the Catholic, it's a very Catholic city, burials all have above ground graves. And the fun part about that is because the water table is so high, they bury them in these crypts. Well, scavengers get into those crypts. Rats, mice, things like that love to chew on bone. Dogs, cats, all sorts of things. Pull these bones out. And the bones are literally laying all over the place in the graveyard. Funny thing is, a lot of people, tourists who are going through those graveyards all the time, even the people who care for the graveyards, don't really recognize the fragments of bone as being just that. So in fact, they just go through and they think, oh, there's twigs all over the ground. It's not. It's not. In fact, when I taught there, I gave my students extra credit to go out and take photographs of bits of bone, and if they identified it properly, I would give them bonus credit for it. And every single student took me up on it. There were bones everywhere. People found full skulls, sets of dentures, all kinds of stuff that came out of the graves. So don't think that not very well kept graveyards is a not American problem. We've got it everywhere. Question number 6. What is the ancestry of the individual? Now, quick rundown of ancestry, ethnicity, and nationality. Ancestry is who your family is, whom your parents are, what traits you have. Asians have a very specific trait. Sub-Saharan Africans have certain traits, and Caucasoids, which are generally people ostensibly from Europe and that sort of ancestry, but it includes India and all kinds of parts of the world. Pakistan, all the stands really, um, are included in the Caucasoid group. Those are ancestral groups, and those are literally the only three that we as anthropologists break them down to. Ethnicity, which is ancestry is often mistaken for ethnicity. Ethnicity is literally what your culture is, what food you eat, what clothing you wear, your culture. Can you be of Asian descent and be American ethnically? You bet. There's billions of people around the world who don't live where they were people sort of came up 10,000 years ago. So ethnicity is literally chosen by the individual. You can choose to be any ethnicity you want. If you want to adopt the culture and practices and lifestyle of a different culture from the one you were born in, hey, have at it. That's your new ethnicity. That's all there is to it. It has nothing to do with your biological profile. Finally, nationality just counts as what country you claim as your own. And not surprising, nationality can change all the time. Your nationality, if you lived in what used to be the USSR up until 1990, you may now be Ukrainian. You may now be Yugo or Slavic or Czech. All of that is different now. But that's just because your nationality has shifted. It has nothing. You didn't even have to move or even adopt a different culture or anything. It is just whatever flag happens to be waving over that chunk of land you occupy right now. And that can change. Does that make sense? Okay, moving on. Skeletal remains can tell us a lot about the ancestry of an individual. It's sometimes difficult to make this determination very easily. There are a lot of factors to it. And I would caution, this is something that beginners in forensic anthropology always fall into. That is the idea that you can base it on one or two traits that you find, and then you can make an assumption as to the ancestry that they would fall into. That pitfall is exploited by a lot of people, and it foils them often. The biggest issue is intermingling, intermixing, right? A lot of us have, in fact, nobody in this class or any other is a quote purebred. Let me tell you, everybody in here is admixed. Admixture happens. We are healthier because of it. If you don't believe me, take my one-on-one class. You'll find that out. So we're healthier, we're better off, we're all admixed. So it's the job of the physical and forensic anthropologist to narrow that down and say, okay, especially in forensics, we have to then communicate with not only the lay public, but also law enforcement. They're going to say, well, I can look at him and say, well, this guy was probably about 30% African American, 10% Caucasoid, and 60%, I guess, Asiatic. And the cop will say, okay, so what am I looking for? Who am I looking for? A black guy, white guy, or an Asian guy? They're like, well, he's going to be an Asian guy with dark skin. That kind of thing. We have to break down these determinations and then simplify them for the lay public, especially when we're doing a decedent search, trying to figure out who this person was. So these things are determined by a lot of things. A few examples are here. We'll go into some more in a few minutes. Interorbital space, which is the space between their eyes, is important. Nasal aperture, that is the size and shape of the nose opening in the skull. The mandible can show us a lot of things. The shape of the skull, there are all sorts of bits. The mandible can also tell us about sex. What is the sex of the individual? The sex of the individual is best determined from the pelvis. Why would that be? Any ideas? More than likely, almost all of you came up with, well, women have to make babies come through the birth canal. So not surprisingly, we look at certain areas in a pelvis. Now, a lot of people want to base things on size. In other words, if I have a large pelvis, it must be male. Smaller pelvis must be female. If you were to do that based on size between these two, you may think the larger one, which is this one down here, is the male. You would be wrong. Remember the birth canal. That's this opening here. In the middle of the pelvis, you're going to see in males, it's much smaller and kind of heart-shaped. The coccyx, which is the tailbone, dips down into it, and it's much narrower. This angle here is much narrower in males. Look at this. Much wider opening. The coccyx is actually pushed back a little bit to make more space for that little baby to squeeze through. And this angle down here, look at how much wider this angle is compared to this very acute angle here. Now, in the Anthro 119, which is the follow-up lab course to this, we will see a lot of os coxae, this the hip bones here, and be able to work out how to determine, even just by looking at one. Here we've got three bones, right? We've got the two os coxae, that's this and this on either side, and then this bone here called the sacrum in the middle. These three bones make up the pelvis. Oftentimes we'll only find one or maybe two. So it's pretty easy to see these angles even with just the single bone. Sex of a decedent can be determined by the skull, the os coxa, as I just mentioned. These are the hip bones here. You're looking at it from the side, actually from the inside. The hip would kind of come out to the side here on the other side. And the femur. The femur is the upper thigh bone. A lot of things can help us determine this, and a lot of different features. I'll go through a few of them for each of these next. First, the skull. The skull is the second best place we can get sex information from. Obviously, the pelvis absolutely hands down the best. The femur is way, way distant third. Okay, so males tend to have a more what we call robust skull. That means the features tend to be more rugose, tend to be more rough. So we see big, bony outgrowths where the muscles attach. Now, it's not because men are building up their facial muscles. It has everything to do with hormones. Hormones cause those muscles to grow a little larger, and they cause this bone to grow out a little bit in order to attach to those muscles. So we tend to see in males, we say, a much larger brow ridge. That's the kind of eyebrow ridge going on up here. We call it a supraorbital torus or ridge. We see barely any with females. They have a much higher forehead. We have a sharp orbital border, or supraorbital margin is what we call this. On females, we have a much more blunt or rounded supraorbital margin. On males, pronounced muscle attachments, larger canines in males, larger teeth usually all the way around. Males tend to have a very square chin. They tend to have this gonial eversion back here, which is sort of a outgrowth again for the chewing muscles. Tend to see a pretty stark musculature attachment going down the side of the parietals on the sides of the head. We see much less of that in women. They tend to be much more round. The chin tends to be round or pointy compared to the squared off male chin. They tend to not have that gonial eversion as much as males. There's all sorts of stuff that play a big part in women compared to males. Converse to the robustness of males, we see the gracility or gracile, which is the same root word as graceful. It means sort of soft and flowing in women. So after a while, you get pretty good at just right off the bat noticing the difference. And here we've got two pretty extreme examples. We've got a very male on the left and a very female on the right. There are, again, a lot of features we have to look at before we say it's definitely male or female. That's important to note. The sex of the decedent as well as the ancestry has to be based on more than one or two categorizations or traits that we base it on. Males, as we went over it before, the pubic arch here or the pubic angle is much more narrow. Females, it's much wider. The birth canal is much larger. There's other things that we look for as well in male to female. But I'll tell you right now that by far and away, the most reliable skeletal feature of the human body to determine sex is absolutely the pelvis. The second is the skull, and everything else is a distant third. So if you want to be definite as to male or female, go with the pelvis. Okay, as I mentioned, there are some features that will tend to show male over female. However, most of these are dated, meaning back when we were a lot more sexist and a lot less equal. So we tended to assume males were larger. So we look at things like the head of the femur. Generally speaking, male humans are about 10% larger than female humans. So we tend to see a larger head of the femur. You notice now I'm using a lot of qualifiers because there are big women. There are little men. So in a tiny little guy who stands 5'2", like, I don't know, Charles Manson, 5'2", tiny little fella. And some big woman, I can't think of one right off the bat, maybe China, that old wrestler from way back in the day. She stands, I think, 6'2" or something. She's a much larger woman. So, of course, her bones are going to be bigger. Furthermore, we look at, there's a line down the backside of the femur. This is called the linea aspera, which is an attachment point for the hamstring muscles. It's going to be larger and more rugose on most men and smaller on most females. But we know people are cross-training, people are runners, all that stuff. And women can do it too. And when they do, they build up a lot more muscle than the average guy who's sitting there watching TV on the couch is going to have. So it is not a foregone conclusion that larger and more robust muscles mean male. It can also mean female in today's day and age. So don't fall into that trap too much. In general, yes, it does follow the same old, but there are a lot more exceptions to the rule than there used to be, and it is something you definitely want to avoid. So go with the pelvis, go with the skull. Don't go with the arms and legs so much. Question number 8. What is the age at the time of death of the individual? Now, for this, there are a few things that we love to see. First of all, the teeth can tell us an awful lot, but teeth, especially by the age of about 7, most of the adult teeth are in, and the child baby teeth or milk teeth or deciduous, meaning not permanent teeth, have gone away. Prior to that, teeth tend to erupt. They come through the gum line at a very definitive rate. We can tell the age of a child by looking at their teeth quite easily. It gets a little harder with adults, though. Now we've lost this tooth thing. The last tooth to come in are our wisdom teeth, which is this one way over here and way up here. Those used to be called the 21-year molars. I will bet you most of my classes, you guys are usually in your 20s, so you're much younger than me, for example. probably getting your molars, your third molars, your wisdom teeth much earlier. In fact, I would bet at least a few of you got it at 15, 16, 17. Most of you are getting those molars much earlier. The reason is nutrition is better, health is better across the board. Kids are developing teeth quicker. The old adage was the lower central incisor teeth. Those are these down here. These two little pokey teeth are usually the first two to come through. Back in the day, those teeth used to protrude between 1 year and 2 years old. And I will bet you, almost all of you who are parents are shaking your head right now, because those teeth are protruding at 4 months, 3 months, much earlier than they used to. Again, has everything to do with childhood and prenatal health care and nutrition. So moms, you're much healthier when you're carrying the baby. Therefore, the baby comes out larger usually on average, and those teeth are popping out way earlier than they used to. We look at other aspects. Here's our old friend the femur again. But here you guys can see there's a distance, and we'll go into this more later on. Don't worry if your notes are getting a bit cloudy. Do you guys see this little space between the pieces of bone here? Well, these things are attaching. And when they're attaching, they have to grow together. So this growth is caused by this forming and these being connected with cartilage. The cartilage eventually ossifies, becomes bone, it gets changed into bone by the body, and these two things fuse together. This fusion rate changes throughout the body as well. The last bone in the human body that the ends fuse onto is actually the collarbone, the clavicle, and the manubrial side, the inner corner of that. So with that, we can use, and it usually happens around about 21 to 26 years old. So using that, we can get a pretty good idea on young adults and their age. Even though they're adults and their teeth have all been in for several years, we can now start using other bones and determining about the fusion. Then there's some things that happen in older age. One of the most famous and fairly popular ways of doing it is, again, here's our os coxa again. You guys remember this? This is this hip bone, but now we're looking at it from the inside. This is the auricular surface because it looks kind of like an ear. And this is called the pubic symphysis. And the pubic symphysis has a surface that looks like this. Now, in life, these two, there's one on this side and the other one matches up to it, and they're held together by fibrous cartilage. But this has a very distinctive kind of shape to it. They call it billowy and all kinds of things. There are phases which it goes through, and those are associated with age groups. The age groups get wider and wider and wider. With children's teeth, we can tell within usually a few months how old that baby was. With young adults, we can usually narrow it down to about a year or two. With older adults, it spans out to about 5 years with using things like the pubic symphysis. With much older adults, when we get into the age of, let's say, between 60 and 80, 90 years old, then we're talking it might get within a decade. Sometimes it spans more than a decade when they really get up there in age. Other things that we look at, the fusion. These are the sutures, well, cranial sutures. This is the lambdoidal suture. This is the sagittal suture. These are sutures where the bones are coming together. They're kind of like, you can think of them like if you intertwine your fingers. You see there's some fingers coming off this parietal bone and some fingers coming off this parietal bone. They kind of join in the middle, and they form this squiggly line. Well, this can tell us a lot, including ancestry. But the rate at which these things actually fuse together, they fuse together later in age. Usually around about the age of 50 to 60, these will start obliterating, start disappearing, because these two bones are fusing together much later in life. This one you can see is a young adult. This individual is probably in their 20s or 30s. The other thing we look at is the lumbar spine. This is the lower spine, right down here in your lower back, right before where it merges into your pelvis. This is a young individual. Do you see how healthy and thick these intervertebral discs are? Right? And as a result, there's no arthritis here. Nice, clean, crisp edges here. Here, do you guys see these sort of protrusions on either side of the vertebrae? Here's the intervertebral disc. This one and this one are virtually annihilated. They're not there anymore. And it gets, do you guys look at this, see the end of this here? Do you guys remember the old animated Grinch who stole Christmas way back? I think these look like Grinch lips. You'll hear me say that. The Grinch lips. This is actually arthritis. And here's the tough part, guys, especially if you're an older adult. Almost everybody after the age of about 40 has some of this. Not to this extreme, but you're going to have a little bit of arthritis way down here in your lower back. Why? Because our lifestyle is pretty tough on our lower back. Now, this will be accelerated if you do things like horseback riding, motorcycle riding, bicycle riding. So here we have two individuals. We've got a young person. This person's around about age 5. And you can see these sutures are still clearly very open. They haven't fused together yet. This one, we see the sutures are obliterated. You can see there's still a little trace of it going down. So this person is a much older individual. Now you can look at their teeth too. They're missing a lot of teeth. But don't base your age on that. People can lose their teeth very early on, and a lot of people do. So this individual, based on their suture closure, would probably ring in around about 50 to 60 years old. Late 50s, early 60s, somewhere in there. Whereas this person is a much younger person. Here we've got much younger still. Again, we've got our little 5-year-old here. Mandible's fused. Mandible is unfused in this. There's a suture. You can see that all of these cranial sutures are still quite open. In fact, this bone is absolutely separated from this one and this one. You see that? You can see all these sutures are open. There's fontanelles, which are the soft spots where these sutures come together. There's a soft spot here and a soft spot there and a soft spot here, and the same on the other side. The fontanelles, don't worry, you can't stab your little brother with your finger. Can with a pencil, though. Don't stab your baby brother in the head with a pencil. Anyway, so this is a neonate. This is a newborn baby. This is what their heads look like. And they're all messed up. They're all out of shape. This bending out of shape, as I showed you with that, quote, Atacama alien skeleton, which is not. It's a stillborn baby skull. And that's because it gets bent out of shape it becomes this kind of pear shape or even a cone shape when going through the birth canal. This baby lived for a while after birth, so that you can see the skull kind of started to form out a little bit better. It started to get its rounder shape back. That'll happen naturally over time. But it still has a ways to go, and this child died probably within the first month of life. Again, we can look at the teeth. Here our 5-year-old who does have some adult teeth. His molars are adult. His canine teeth have just started pushing out. So he's starting to lose canine teeth. But his front teeth, these two in the middle are adult teeth. These two down at the bottom are adult teeth. These two are not. He also does not have his premolars yet. These are adult teeth. Now, you might think, oh my God, this person lost all their teeth. They didn't. This actually happened after death. You can see these capsules, we call them the crypts for the teeth, or the sockets for the teeth, are still very clearly defined. This means the teeth got loose and fell out after this person was dead. You can see this tooth was growing in. And the rest of the teeth, we have extensive dental work here, which would go back to our is it modern idea. Remember that? Well, you don't find dental work in early peoples around the world. Although you can even figure out now if there's like a gold tooth or a bridged silver tooth, which is connected to another tooth beside it, that may be, not necessarily, but may be an indicator of someone who died prior to the 1960s. It's an earlier thing. And actually, there are dental anthropologists who literally just work with teeth, and they will look at it, or a forensics odontologist, which is a forensics dentist, basically, will look at the teeth, and they can actually date the dental work based on how those teeth were worked on. However, there are a lot of dentists who will go back and use the old school methods sometimes, and sometimes they do it to save money as well. So you can never be 100% certain on that. Question number 9. What is the stature? Here we've got a relatively old picture, but this is an individual who's using what's called a bone box. It's simply a device. That's this clear plastic device here. It's simply a device that measures the overall length of long bones. The long bones are generally in the appendages and in the arms and legs. Here he's measuring our old friend the femur, and what he's trying to get is the overall height of the individual. Now, you heard me say it before, stature doesn't just mean height. It also means build. So there's some other things that we'll look at, like biiliac breadth, which tells us the width of the individual in their prime, which is interesting. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So we look at other things other than just height, but height is a big one because that's how people can tell who the individual was. And remember, most of what our driving force here is to figure out who they were. Finally, question number 10. What are the individual characteristics of the remains? In other words, what can we see in these bones that makes them an individual? So if I can look at it and say, oh, they broke their femur years ago, and then I can say, hey, did Uncle Charles have a broken leg that was a little bit shorter than his other leg on the right side? He did. He broke his right leg with a tractor accident back in 1996 or something like that. Radiographs can tell us a lot. If we are lucky enough to have an idea of who it might be, we can contact their physicians and see if they had any x-rays that were taken when they were still alive from a surgery or an accident or a break or something. And then we can see things in their x-rays that match the actual bones we're looking at. So obviously here we've got fingers. And you guys can see these bony outgrowths. This is arthritis. And we can say, hey, this has a very unique look, this arthritis. So let me look at the actual bone. If we had this bone and we see this same growth, hey, now we're starting to narrow down. This is probably that individual. This is a spine that had a severe fracture in the spine. And so again, if we could find this vertebra and say, okay, is there a fracture here, or is there arthritis from the fracture? Here's another arthritic outgrowth, which will tell us a little bit about that individual if we can match it. There's a lot of other things we can look at in a radiograph, also known as an X-ray or an MRI. Other information, trauma and pathologies. Now, these will always break into antemortem, meaning before death. Another way of saying this is pre-mortem, P-R-E, pre-mortem, or antemortem, meaning before death. Post-mortem, meaning after death, or the one that we really get excited about, perimortem. That means at or around the time of death, which means it could be associated with what killed this individual. Now let's look at some things. First of all, over here, this is again our old friend the femur. Here we've got the head of a femur, and if you guys can see all of this outgrowth here, that's a very arthritic femur. They would have had arthritic hip. Okay, so they would have had trouble walking. With arthritis this bad, they would have had some trouble walking. Their hips would have really hurt when they walk. That is ante or pre-mortem, isn't it? Because we've got bone growth in association with the disease. Things only grow when you're still alive. Okay? Down here we've got a very interesting one. So I'm going to leave that for last because I'll put a little quiz to it for a second. Don't worry, it's just a little individual thing to be fun. Over here, we've got a bullet hole in the side of their head. This is the entry wound. We'll talk a lot about entry and exit wounds and trauma later on. That's the fun part. But we don't see any signs of healing around it, which means it was either post-mortem because there's no healing, or perimortem, at or around the time of death because there's no healing. Now, how do we tell the difference between those two? Well, it really has to do with the bone's reaction. Bone, when it's still alive, when it's still wet bone, that's what we call it, because it's got blood and everything else running through it, is more bendy. It bends more. It fractures. It breaks differently than dry bone. Think of it like a dry twig. How easily you can pick up a dry little twig and snap it because it's very brittle, right? Because it's dried out and old. Whereas if you take a green twig, a twig off of a branch or something, and try to break that, it doesn't break. It bends a lot, doesn't it? And it'll kind of split and break a little bit, but not very much. The green stick doesn't break nearly as cleanly as a dry twig. Same thing with bone. So we could actually tell, judging by other aspects of the bone, as to whether this was perimortem or postmortem. Now, our little quiz. Do you see all these holes drilled in this head? This skull has 2 holes drilled in the frontal, right here. A hole drilled right across the suture. This is the sagittal suture. And then 2 more holes drilled in the parietal and occipital bones. But look closely. Do you guys see how the edges of these holes are rounded? And it looks like the hole was originally this big, and now you can see it's filled in with bone. How do things fill in with bone? It's got to be healing. And if it's healing, that person was alive. This is actually a surgery called trepanation. This came from a mentor of mine, John Verano. This is something he specialized in. Trepanation is a cutting of holes in the skull to relieve intracranial pressure. They still do this surgery today, but this surgery was done in the 1200s, like back in medieval time. They did this surgery quite a lot on this individual, saved his life, and he survived. Now, here's another interesting little thing with this skull is if you look over here. You guys see that? That's a huge smashing fracture. Somebody hit him in the side of his head with a club. Broke his skull. You can see the healed fracture went all the way up and around here. And all of this part was damaged. And the side of his eye was damaged. So this caused an epidural bleed. They had to relieve the pressure. Otherwise, he would have died. So they cut holes here. Didn't work. Cut another hole here. Started to work. Cut another hole here. Another hole here. And a third and a 5th hole here. Finally relieved that pressure on his brain. And guess what? He survived. For a while at least. But probably succumbed eventually to infection. Pretty fascinating stuff. These traumas can tell us about the individual. and who they were, especially if we're still working on an ID. But they can also tell us how they died, what circumstances in which they died, and a lot more information. So we'll talk a lot more about those things later on. But now you're getting an idea of what we do in day-to-day anthropology in forensics.